Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered international development and gender-based violence. Mr McCabe, thank you for being here, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I do, however, have very little pleasure in debating today's motion. Gender-based violence is a scourge upon the world that has devastating and lifelong implications for survivors. At its core, gender-based violence refers to harmful acts directed towards an individual based on their gender. It occurs because of gender inequality, abuse of power, and harmful and outdated norms. And while it is predominantly directed towards women and girls, it also impacts men and boys. Across the world, millions suffer from these appalling crimes, all too often in silence. It is estimated that 1 in 3 women will experience sexual or physical violence in their lifetime, a statistic that gets considerably worse during conflicts, displacements, and at times of crises. Gender-based violence comes in many forms and can include sexual, physical, mental abuse, as well as harassment, coercion, manipulation. It is domestic abuse. It is sexual violence in conflict. It is child marriage, female genital mutilation, and it is honour crimes. The list goes on, Mr. Chairman. Such acts take place both in private and in public, and its prevalence has not only increased over the course of this year as a result of the pandemic. At the start of this year, the United Nations estimated that 242 million women and girls were subjected to sexual or physical violence in the preceding 12 months. Another statistic that will have only increased over the course of this year. Such acts are used as an effective tool to ostracize individuals, to exert power over others, and to spread fear and subjugation into communities and into individuals. As outlined in the Human Rights Watch's latest report, They Treated Us in Monstrous Ways, which documents crimes of sexual violence against men in Syria by both state and non-state actors. Such actions are now commonplace in conflict zones and crises. Rape and sexual violence are effectively being used as weapons of war, a weapon that costs nothing to the perpetrator and everything to the survivor. As detailed by ActionAid in 2017, over 87,000 women and girls were intentionally killed. That equates to 137 a day, and yet these are the numbers that we know about. Millions more are likely to be suffering in silence, locked behind closed doors and subjected to horrors that are unimaginable to any of us. As a nation after nation entered their own lockdowns, schools were closed, offices shut, and places of public interaction and engagement sealed off. So too were places of safety. Millions of people were denied access to those areas where they might briefly find some degree of normality and peace from their perpetrators. And the United Nations estimated that in the 6 months of lockdown would result in 31 million cases of gender-based violence, just over 5 million a month, Mr. Chairman. And with the closure of schools, millions more girls no longer able to access an education will be forced into child marriage. The full impact of COVID-19 will not be known for quite some time, but what we know now is a small glimpse of how widespread and prevalent this issue has become. Gender-based violence is a pandemic within a pandemic. Yesterday was notable for 2 reasons. First, it was the UN International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Second, the United Kingdom announced its decision to cut our international development budget. In honour of the UN Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, I launched an international statement that was supported by parliamentarians from this Parliament and 9 others. And that statement called for the protecting of funding for programmes to tackle all forms of gender-based violence at home and abroad, working together to find new ways to support women and girls at risk of gender-based violence, and third, ensuring that women leaders are at the heart of our response to gender-based violence. I would be grateful to the Minister responding today as to whether or not he might let this House know whether he supports this statement, as I think nearly every other member here has signed that statement. On this, the second day of 16 days of activism to eliminate violence against women, we are holding this debate and hoping to ensure that UK does not shirk its international responsibilities to help some of those in the most difficult situations across the globe. I find it difficult, Mr. Chairman, to understand how the UK can take such a short-term approach to our international obligations, reputation, and indeed moral duty by cutting 0.7% to 0.5%. It may well have been billed as temporary measure and to deal with an unprecedented financial situation, but so too was income tax, and I therefore will not be holding my breath. I hope I am not considered to be overly idealistic, to believe that the UK is internationally recognised for the work that we do through our development budget. It is aid that is given for no other intention than to support the most vulnerable and those who are suffering. So much of what has been said in the last 24 hours seems to have focused purely on the financial, rather than the enormous benefit of the support and humanitarian assistance that we send across the globe. From the 6 million girls provided with decent education to the almost 52 million people who are being given clean access to water, or the 76 million children who have been vaccinated. All in the last 5 years, our aid budget has been able to make a difference to vulnerable women and girls from across developing economies. I will, of course, Mr. Chairman, do all I can to see that that 0.7% is returned. But for the purposes of this debate, I wish to point out that within previous spending rounds of our development budget, spending on GBV has ranked at the very lowest level. Of the 14 billion spent on international aid, just 0.3% is spent on ending violence against women and girls. This needs to be rectified, and I would like to ask that the government considers the ring-fencing of 1% of the 0.5% to ensure long-term funding and commitment to tackling gender-based violence and supporting those who are so often overlooked, left behind and ignored. 2020 is undoubtedly a year that none of us are going to be looking back upon fondly, but it has been an important one for a number of reasons. It is the 20th anniversary of the UK signing UN Security Council 1325, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and the first year of the decade of action on the Sustainable Development Goals, focusing on action in gender and women's empowerment. It is the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action. And while we might reflect on how far we have come since signing those commitments to tackle these issues, we might also reflect as to how far we have yet to go in order to end gender-based violence and to reach gender equality. Fortunately, Mr. Chairman, I am an optimist. I have to be an optimist. And I believe that the UK can still achieve its commitments and maintain some semblance of its international reputation. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, I have consistently asked the government to introduce an international body to be based here in the United Kingdom that collects and documents information around sexual violence in conflict, supports survivors, and leads international prosecutions against those who commit such atrocious crimes such as sexual violence in conflict. We can shatter the culture of impunity, and with President-elect Biden soon to take office, we have a unique opportunity to be able to implement an organisation that would support so much of the work that he accomplished as a senator around women's rights. Some might question why I have decided to take up this issue, but for me it is obvious. If men are 99% of the problem, we have to be 50% of the solution. As the Voluntaries Overseas Service points out, change will only work when men change their attitudes around violence towards women and girls. A new era of activism and education is needed, and it can be led by the SCDO and supported by the development budget. And I hope that the Minister will work with me and others in this chamber to develop that programme and to ensure that this issue is firmly on the agenda at each and every international event. And with that in mind, next year the UK is set to host the G7, and the Prime Minister will undoubtedly be including his Women's Education Initiative on that agenda. I would like to urge the Minister, and the Prime Minister if he's watching, to include gender-based violence and preventing sexual violence in conflict on that agenda. If we are to succeed in supporting more women into education, we need to address gender-based violence. They are interlocked pieces of the same jigsaw, and success cannot be had in one without the other. Mr. Chairman, the government has launched some truly brilliant programmes, such as What Works to Prevent Violence Impact at Scale, and put over £67.5 million worth of funding into it. But it can and must go further, and it must build upon the funding, it must build upon access to services, it must build upon access to police action and justice, and above all, prevention. We have routinely committed to holding a second PSVI conference in this country, only to see it further kicked down the road. So I hope next year, in 2021, a year of conferences, we might commit again to holding an international conference where we can address the issue of gender-based violence. I am proud, Mr. Chairman, that the Union Jack is recognised across the world as a symbol of aid and assistance, and that it arrives without caveats. The UK has real power, soft and other, and in supporting people in the most difficult parts of the world, it can continue to commit to those people. We should never forget that, and I hope that today's debate, which sadly is all too short, will demonstrate the strength of feeling about this issue, about international development, and what we can do in the world to make it a better place for those who suffer so badly. Thank you.